Good afternoon, and welcome to the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation's Meet the Scientist monthly webinar series. I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein, BBRF's President and CEO. Today, Dr. Kate Fitzgerald will present Developing New Treatments for Childhood Anxiety and OCD. Can cognitive control help kids grow out of illness? BBRF is the world's largest private funder of mental health research grants, supporting transformative discoveries in order to develop improved treatments, cures, and methods of prevention. The high quality of the research we fund is made possible by the BBRF Scientific Council. This group of 184 prominent mental health researchers reviews each grant application and selects the most promising ideas with the greatest potential to lead to breakthroughs. The Scientific Council guides the foundation to fund creative and impactful basic, translational, and clinical research relevant to the whole spectrum of mental health. One reason that research funded by BBRF has had such a great impact is because we do not limit our focus to one illness or condition. Since 1987, the Foundation has awarded more than $440 million to fund more than 6,400 research grants around the world and across a broad spectrum of brain illnesses, including addiction, ADHD, anxiety, autism, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, depression, eating disorders, OCD, PTSD, schizophrenia, as well as suicide prevention. Today, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Kate Fitzgerald. Dr. Fitzgerald is the Ruane Professor of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at the Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons and New York State Psychiatric Institute. She was a 2007 and 2013 Young Investigator. Our webinar will begin with Dr. Fitzgerald's presentation, which will then be followed by Q&A. To submit your questions, please use the questions tab on the control panel. We will ask as many questions as time allots following the presentation. And now I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Fitzgerald. Kate, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Jeff. And I just wanted to mention also, I remember when I got that 2000, it was then NARSAD, but BBRF Young Investigator Award, and what a huge difference it makes for clinician scientists like me launching their careers. I called my dad. I just remember being on the phone celebrating. So just a little snapshot of how much that award means to people. But, to get started here, I wanted to kind of provide context about anxiety, which rates of anxiety disorders that is clinically significant are really rising, including since the pandemic. But if you think about anxiety, it serves a purpose. Anxiety is not by nature abnormal. Sort of the fight or flight response, as you see here on the left of the screen, it lets you know you got to get out of danger. Nowadays we're probably not being chased by dinosaurs or bears too much, but we do experience anxiety in a helpful, adaptive way many times when it just shows you care. It revs you up a little bit to prepare for that test, to prepare for, say, a piano recital. It gives you, it emphasizes or underscores motivation. But where that normative anxiety that can be helpful and adaptive really shifts into a disorder, that's a problem, is when it's causing kids, adolescents, and for that matter, adults, really distress and getting in the way of normative function. As a kid, it's your job to go to school, so maybe keeping you from school, or to make friends, or to have positive family relationships. And what's interesting about anxiety, as you think about it over the course of development, is that transition from what is a typical kind of that normative or adaptive or even just normal anxiety to atypical follows a continuum where you will see sort of some of the same normative anxiety concerns, such as monsters or, imaginary things, certain situations, separating from school, I mentioned. When it gets to be too much and getting in the way, this is the age group of preschool, very young kids that are most likely to experience separation anxiety disorder. And then as you go up through development from preschool to grade school and then adolescence, the types of clinically significant anxiety that you see does tend to mirror what kids normally care about. So for example, in grade school, kids are becoming more interested in following rules, being competent. So what is the meaning of their own health and staying safe? And you see at this point, anxiety disorders such as generalized anxiety disorder become more common. And then going into adolescence, it's completely normal and helpful for a teenager to really care what other people think. And that can kind of morph over into being terrified that you're going to be embarrassed, or social anxiety disorder. So anxiety from typical to atypical really seems to follow this developmental continuum across this range of severity. What's also true of anxiety in children is that anxiety disorders tend to start very early. Probably the earliest of any type of mental health problem in children is clinically significant anxiety. And what you see here is data from a community sample where preschoolers were studied at age 3 and again at age 6. And on the left-hand side of the screen, you see sort of a laundry list of all the different types of mental health problems that children present with. And what you'll notice is that the very most common, as many as 20% of this community sample, so these were not like treatment-seeking kids necessarily, but 20% experienced some type of anxiety disorder. By age 6, anxiety disorders continued to be the most prevalent in that age range, but sometimes you'll hear, or you may be familiar with anxiety kind of burning its way into depression. So that 20% that was at age 3 seems to be transitioning a little bit. But again, point being, anxiety disorders are incredibly common and start at young ages. So who do all these clinically anxious children grow up to be? Well, we know that by the time of adolescence, 1 in 3 youth will have experienced an anxiety disorder. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's a life sentence. While we do know that early life anxiety increases risk for depression, as I mentioned, substance abuse, school dropout, even suicide, there are many kids that get better. And what I want to emphasize here is that the work in my lab, including what was funded by BBRF, is to look at how can we shift trajectories of anxiety that emerges early towards trajectories of health. And we know that many of our most high achieving individuals in our society have struggled with anxiety or depression. So is it possible to sort of manage it? Yes, and maybe even shift this trajectory. So how do we manage or help anxiety now in terms of what are currently available treatments? Well, we do have good treatments that are evidence-based. And what I'm showing you here is a large multi-center trial. It included almost 400 youth ages 7 to 18 who had some type of anxiety disorder, whether separation, social, generalized, and so on. And what was found in these kids is that as many as 80%, as you see here in this purple bar, will get better after 3 months treatment with cognitive behavior therapy in combination with a medicine. So sertraline is what that abbreviation is for. If you treat with only sertraline or only cognitive behavior therapy, sort of as monotherapy, the children also do significantly better than just placebo. So there is help. But what I think many families struggle with, and certainly we do as clinicians, is that while 80% is a pretty robust response rate in medicine, many families and children do not want medication. And so if you're looking at just psychotherapy, that is the cognitive behavior therapy, only 60% respond. So that leaves 40% that, we'd like to understand, how can we do better? And if you look on the left, the first data I presented are anxiety disorders. On the right here, you see obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD. And as with the first study in anxious kids, cognitive behavior therapy plus medication, sertraline, did better in the kids with OCD as compared to medicine alone or CBT, but not as well, you'll see, as for the anxiety disorders. Here, with the combination treatment, about 50% got better. And then if you look at the CBT only 40% or so got better. So all of this is to say, how do we make our treatments better? And this little guy that you just saw pop up here is a young kid. He's a preschooler is what he's supposed to indicate. And we know that cognitive behavior therapy, which is what so many families want, is actually tougher to do the littler you are. And so again, kind of begging the question of, can we develop interventions that start early in life and augment or maybe are alternative to the ones that we have now to help more kids feel well? So thinking about this, in our lab, we have started with asking, well, why does CBT work? Granted, it doesn't work for everybody, but when it does work, what is it doing? On the left-hand side of the screen, you see this kind of vicious cycle of anxiety, where whether it's OCD with an obsession or some type of anxiety problem with fears or worries, these are repetitive negative thoughts that cause distress. And even though young kids will have some insight that this is too much worry, this is excessive, or maybe even it doesn't make sense, that worry can be so distressing that kids will engage in either avoidance behaviors for anxiety, like I'm just not going to school, or with OCD compulsions, which are repetitive behaviors that kids will realize they don't make sense, but they're intended to neutralize this distress. And what happens is temporarily, these OCD and anxious types of behaviors do reduce distress. But the problem with that is that it goes back and it reinforces that, lo and behold, that worry, that fear, that obsession really was something to be concerned about in the first place. And you better keep performing these avoidant or compulsive behaviors to make it go away if you want to feel better. So how might we break this vicious cycle? We have hypothesized about and been testing, that's kind of what the rest of the talk is going to go from here on, that having something called cognitive control may be the capacity, the executive function, the effortful control. There's lots of things that you can call it that helps you harness or leverage that insight. So you might still feel the fear, but you don't avoid, you do it anyways, you don't compulse. So our hypothesis that we're going to test and talk more about through this talk is that by having cognitive control, this may help break the vicious cycle of anxiety so kids can resist compulsions, tolerate, anxiety-induced distress until it kind of starts to come down on its own and move on to other goal-directed thoughts and behaviors. So like what is really the task at hand, for example, going into school. And in doing this repeatedly, resisting these anxious or OCD-like behaviors, over the long term, this leads to a reduction in kind of the pull, the potency of that obsession and that worry and the related distress, leading to the resolution of disorder when CBT works. So if cognitive control is a mechanism that helps CBT work to help kids get over anxiety and OCD, is this something that we could target at the level of the brain to help those who don't respond to CBT as it's currently delivered? So thinking about that, the level of the brain, we've been interested in finding brain markers of cognitive control that we can try to push around and see if by doing so we could help the anxiety and OCD affected youth get better. So what you're seeing here is something called the error-related negativity. This is measured with an EEG, so the little electrodes across the scalp. And what it is a deflection, which you see here, the error-related negativity that occurs very short time, like 50 to 100 milliseconds after somebody makes a mistake on a simple cognitive task. And this happens in healthy people. And what my colleague from University of Michigan, Bill Gearing, found over 20 years ago now, is that this error signaling is exaggerated, is too much in adults with OCD. This error signal, the ERN, also has been mapped to the anterior cingulate cortex, suggesting that it's an index of this anterior cingulate cortex, or ACC, response to making a mistake. And over the years, this finding of sort of an exaggerated or an amplification of this error signal in OCD in adults has been downward extended to both youth with obsessive-compulsive disorder as well as youth with non-OCD anxiety disorders, such as the generalized anxiety or the social phobia that I mentioned before. So, okay, maybe this error-related negativity, the signal from the anterior cingulate cortex, might be a brain marker of cognitive control, because, you know, when you make a mistake, you're supposed to detect that mistake and go on and correct your behavior, which is sort of what cognitive control is meant to do. But noticing that there is an enlarged error signal in patients with OCD or in patients with anxiety disorders, really from adolescence on up, I think is where the data is strongest for that. It really remains unknown what that means. So I briefly alluded to maybe the error-related negativity could be detecting a mistake so you can adjust your behavior. Another theory about this error signal is that it could reflect affective hypersensitivity, like emotional reactivity to making a mistake. Like, this mistake is a really bad thing, it's something I gotta worry about, consistent with that intrusive sense that something is wrong. And that kind of cuts across the OCD and the different anxiety disorders. As compared to, as I first alluded to, is it an adaptive response? We know that a larger error signal, this ERN specifically, helps people, or at least associates with, performing better on simple cognitive tasks. Could it maybe be a good thing and in some way help youth and adults with anxiety and OCD overcome their symptoms? At some level, maybe that insight we talked about is a representation of a patient acknowledging that this is like a thinking error. I don't need to worry about this. Why am I thinking about that? And being able to detect that thinking error as a mistake and signal for other regions in the brain to help bring on cognitive control could help overcome symptoms. So over the years, I first mentioned the discovery of that ERN and over 20 years ago. And over the years, this error processing, but more broadly, the notion of cognitive control has been studied with a variety of different tasks, not just simple cognitive tasks to elicit mistakes, but other types of tasks, such as inhibiting a prepotent response, working memory tasks, other types of what are commonly known as executive functions. So where do all of these sort of sub-processes of cognitive control come from? Well, using functional MRI, a different technique than that EEG that measured the error-related negativity, a large body of evidence that has shown that error processing, as well as correct responding on cognitively demanding tasks, activates or engages a number of brain regions. So not just that anterior cingulate cortex that was linked to the error signaling on the EEG studies, but to a broader range of networks that function together, including the cinguloopercular network, which does include that ACC I mentioned before, but other regions too, such as the anterior insula, and is believed to be charged with detecting salient events. It's sort of saying, hey, wake up and pay attention, whether it's an error or something else you need to attend to maybe adapt your behavior. And what about that behavioral adaptation? Work has shown that this cinguloopercular network, including the anterior cingulate, will signal to a frontal parietal network for adaptive control. And this includes regions such as the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the parietal cortex, to say, okay, maybe it was a mistake that was made, maybe it's some other reason you have to pay attention, let's bring control online. These two are widely referred to, the cinguloopercular and frontal parietal networks, as, quote, task-positive networks, because they come online when you're doing a cognitively challenging task. And they work inversely or reciprocally with something called a default mode network, which comes online when you're just kind of at rest and allowing your mind to wander, and involves emotion processing regions, more so than cognitive regions of the brain, such as the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, or the VMPFC. So could it be that not just error signaling specifically, whether it's too much of a whether it's a bad thing or whether it's compensatory and a good thing, but could involvement of these tripartite networks that are meant to interact together, but might be interacting together abnormally, drive OCD and or anxiety. So an example from OCD comes from our lab, and specifically my then postdoc, Luke Norman, who is now a research scientist at National Institute of Mental Health. Luke contacted a number of different researchers across the world, and he asked, hey, would you guys contribute some data on OCD patients performing these hard error eliciting tasks? Because what Luke wanted to look at was two sub-processes of cognitive control in OCD patients compared to healthy controls. And those processes were error processing, as we talked about a little bit already, but also something called inhibitory control. So this is, correctly inhibiting an error, for example, so that you perform correctly. And consistent with that hyperactive error signaling work from the EEG studies, Luke found that in the sample of 239 patients with OCD compared to a similar number of healthy controls, the patients had this exaggerated anterior cingulate response to making a mistake. But it wasn't just located to there. It was also located to that anterior insula region, so implicating that larger network, that salience network, as being hyperactive, and these are mostly adults with OCD. By contrast, for the correct responses, so this is performing, these hard cognitive tasks correctly, patients with OCD compared to healthy controls showed hypoactivity, that is deficient recruitment of these task-positive networks, both the cinguloopercular network and that frontal parietal network for adaptive control, suggesting there may be kind of a mismatch of too much response, say, to errors, and too little response in the brain to adaptive or inhibitory control. So Luke interpreted this in the context of a model where he thought, well, gee, maybe what's happening in a patient with OCD, you could also replace it with a patient with anxiety, is this goal interfering obsession, or let's say worry, and the urge to do either a compulsion to negate the obsession, or maybe avoidance to get away from the worry or fear. Maybe that is correctly detected by patients as, an error, and it engages that anterior cingulate cortex, or more broadly, that network called cinguloopercular network, to say, hey, there's a mistake here. but that there's some kind of breakdown in the communication of getting that error signal to the other network in the brain, that dorsolateral prefrontal cortex-based network. I called it the frontal parietal network, to say, hey, let's move on from this obsession or this worry and go on about our business, such that that error signal kind of continues unchecked. That, you know, with the obsession, the anxiety, the worry continuing, signaling more errors, which an error in itself, if you think about it, is kind of anxiety inducing, and that could further increase anxiety. So that was Luke's model based on this finding that there seems to be too much error signaling and too little inhibitory control, at least in adult patients with OCD. But we're talking about child anxiety. Those were mostly adults, as I mentioned. What happens to this anterior cingulate-based response to errors with age, and particularly in younger individuals who are suffering from anxiety or OCD? Is this error signal helpful, hurtful, and does it differ over the age span? Well, first off, looking at just healthy people, what you see on the left-hand side of the screen here is showing you that that error-related negativity, the bigger it is, the more accurate you are. So a larger ERN seems to be driving better performance. And this relationship between a larger ERN and better performance is maintained at younger ages, which you see down here on the bottom. We also know that from childhood, so this is teeny tiny writing, but this is showing you 7-year-olds all the way up to 18-year-olds. And from childhood into like young adulthood, let's say, that error-related negativity gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So the ERN seems to increase with better performance and maturity in healthy individuals. So thinking about this and the potential that, you know, maybe this, from the perspective of maybe this hyperactive error signal, if it's a good thing, better performance, more mature, you know, could it be compensatory? We did an fMRI study looking at error signaling and found that several things. Youth, these were 8 to 18-year-old kids with OCD who were medicated, who were older, who had less severe OCD, and who performed better, all had a larger response to errors. Again, kind of consistent with this notion that maybe boosting cognitive control is helpful in overcoming symptoms. Now, kind of downward extending in age, and sorry to go back and forth on you here, this is flipping back to the EEG measure, that error-related negativity. We know from adult studies and adolescents that youth and adolescents and adults with anxiety disorders have an enlarged ERN compared to healthy groups. But what this emerging work, and others have begun to replicate this, suggests is that there may be a developmental shift in the ERN anxiety relationship. So what Alexandra Meyer and Greg Hychek did in this particular study is they broke kids 8 to 13 years old down in 2 groups, the younger ones and the older ones. And what they found is in the younger ones, sort of the opposite of that adult anxiety relationship. That is, younger children with more anxiety tended to have a littler error signal. Could this suggest that in young individuals, children with anxiety, a smaller, less fully developed ERN could associate to lower cognitive control and maybe set the stage for early anxiety emergence? And then why this shift? Could it be possible that as the brain develops and you normally are getting a larger ERN, there's kind of a compensatory mechanism kicking in? So thinking about error signaling as one metric of cognitive control, these developmental shifts in neural substrate for cognitive control, and the fact that OCD and anxiety for that matter, tends to emerge very early in life. My colleagues, me here, and my colleague Steve Taylor, and here's Luke Norman, now the research scientist at NIMH, excuse me, decided to do a randomized clinical trial where we had kids and adults, so teenagers specifically 13 to 17, and adults 25 to 45 randomized. So it was like a flip of the coin. They could get the cognitive behavior therapy for OCD or a control therapy called stress management training, so that we could look and see if functional MRI imaging of error responding and other aspects of cognitive control change from before to after treatment in the brain, and if they change differently for adolescents and adults who are given gold standard, that is the best treatment for OCD, CBT, versus something that we know doesn't really work. Stress management training, it doesn't hurt you, but it doesn't really help with the very much anyhow with the OCD symptoms. So here you see our across the age span, both adolescents and adults, everybody had to have pediatric onset OCD. We wanted to control for having that type of OCD that onsets early. They had to be moderately affected. So this is the Children Yale Brown obsessive-compulsive score that shows they're bothered and the OCD was interfering. Half were medicated. And what we did is we had these teens and adults prior to treatment, and then again after, in the fMRI scanner, is we had them perform this task called the incentive flanker task here. I might refer to it later as the IFT, where they were shown, hey, if you perform this cognitively demanding challenge here, that is pressing a button that goes with the letter in the middle, you stand to earn some money, or maybe you would stand to lose some money, so that they knew that their performance was motivated, not only maybe because they cared about it, but also they could stand to win or lose money depending on how well they played the game. So the reason we did this is we wanted to look at these two sub-processes of cognitive control, both the error responding when you make a mistake on that target, or the inhibitory control when you respond correctly, but also at reward, because we know that in addition to doing cognitive behavior therapy, feeling the fear and doing it anyways, it not only takes, I'll call it gumption, that sort of cognitive control, but motivation, which is part of the reward processing machinery in the brain. So in the study, our central hypothesis was that more cognitive control in the brain would go with either predict and maybe increase with better CBT response in both adolescents and adults with OCD. And specifically looking at, at the beginning, before you get treatment, what kind of brain predicts better outcomes, we thought that a more normal, like a more like healthy control, if you will, type of a brain. So less error responding, more inhibitory control responding in these networks we've discussed, but potentially also more motivation as indexed by your brain's response to getting the reward on that task I showed you. So this is just showing the breakdown of our subjects. This was, by the way, an interim analysis, so we have more kiddos and adults in some of the later studies I'm going to show you. But what you can see here is that that the ages, that 15 approximately for adolescents, about 31, 32 for adults. And what this is showing you is that prior to treatment, everybody had, moderately severe OCD, which is this is an OCD severity measure. And then here I'm just trying to show you that for the people that were treated, whether they were youth, in green, or adults in orange, the people that were treated with cognitive behavior therapy, that gold standard treatment for OCD, got better. So this line is showing you that the severity of their OCD, which is measured here on the y-axis, decreased over time, whether you were an adolescent or an adult. And that was compared to the stress management therapy or control therapy. They got a little bit better. This actually was significant difference compared to before treatment, but not nearly as much as the gold standard CBT. At the level of the brain, what we found is, as predicted, more ability to engage anterior cingulate cortex, which you see here is this blue blob, during inhibitory control. So during correct responding on that IFT or incentive flanker test, predicted better outcomes in the people that got the CBT. But it was actually the opposite for the control condition, or the active comparator, the stress management therapy. Also, as we were guessing, we saw that the patients who had larger reward responding in this region of the brain, which I showed before as ventral medial prefrontal cortex, had a better response to CBT, but the opposite for the stress management therapy. And, against our prediction, we didn't find anything for errors. We had thought that there would be, less hyperactivity of error responding, and that just didn't pan out to be true in this cohort. So to just briefly summarize this study, what we found was greater baseline inhibitory control in the anterior cingulate cortex, and by that I mean engagement of this region for inhibitory control, and greater engagement of the orbital frontal cortex, or the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. You might hear lingo both ways. Seems to enable patients to benefit from cognitive behavior therapy. And it kind of makes sense if you think that inhibitory control, that ability to adapt your behavior, may allow one to dismiss obsessions and resist compulsions, and thus engage in CBT. And then from a reward perspective, perhaps ability to engage that orbital frontal cortex is indexing your motivation to engage that adaptive control. We also found this was specific to CBT, so it did seem to be, not just getting better in general, which everybody did a little bit, of course the CBT more robustly, but this suggests this may be a mechanism of, maybe not a mechanism of CBT effects. We didn't see change, we just saw a predictor. But it could be that boosting these systems prior to CBT could help people respond even better. So the next study, we used the same experiment, but in this particular analysis, we had more individuals in both the adolescent and the adult groups. And rather than looking at the way the brain functions during a task, a cognitively challenging task, we looked at something called resting state connectivity. Now, what this allows you to do is look at connections between those tripartite networks. So for example, how tightly are, say, that cingulo-opercular network for salience detection, or the frontoparietal network for adaptive control, how tightly are they wired together? And how much do they interact in terms of wiring with this reciprocal network for default mode processing? So to do this, we put these little volumes in the brain in regions that index each one of these three networks to try to understand what types of connections would better predict response to CBT. And here what we found is that less positive connectivity between this ventral medial prefrontal cortex or default mode network, maybe emotion processing region, you could look at it that way, with a lower region of the brain, I call this the caudate, predicted better CBT response. We also found, unlike the previous study where adolescents and adults didn't differ developmentally, that here, and when you talk about resting state function, that is connections between the brain, the kids, the adolescents who responded better to treatment, had a little different pattern in their brain than did the adults. Specifically, the adolescents had greater connectivity between those cognitive control networks and a subcortical region called the striatum, whereas the adults who responded better had greater connectivity between those cognitive control network and between that network and a different subcortical region. So without getting into like too much jargony about the different brain regions, overall what this suggested is that a predictor specific to CBT at the level of the brain is connectivity of this emotion processing region, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, being lower with subcortical regions, which has in prior work been thought to be hyperactive in OCD, this subcortical to ventral medial prefrontal cortex. So less connectivity kind of makes sense in predicting better response. And there is, in terms of understanding these regions, it could suggest greater influence less effective influence, over action selection. We also found some developmentally sensitive predictors with adolescents having greater connectivity with these task control networks, perhaps underpinning ability to dismiss OCD urges in favor of goal-directed behaviors. And then finally, in adults, it was a little bit different finding with different regions between the frontal parietal network and subcortical regions of the brain. So essentially to say that considering development is probably important. There may be different predictors of CBT response at different ages. And important here, the developmentally sensitive predictors did appear to be non-specific across the two treatments. So one of the last points I want to make, second to the last point, is again going back to the well on this OCD CBT study. We were surprised and frankly a little bit frustrated that while we could find brain predictors of CBT response, we couldn't find brain changes that changed with better response to cognitive behavior therapy. And we were scratching our heads and wondering why this might be. And one of the things that we were concerned about is the way that we traditionally analyze these fMRI or functional magnetic resonance imaging data is we use group averages. We lump together all the adolescents, we lump together all the adults, and then we look for differences across these groups. And the concern is that maybe we're missing important changes in the brain that underlie CBT effect in OCD because we're getting rid of individual differences among different individual adolescents, among different individual adults that could be important. And so to address this issue, we partnered with Adrian Beltz at the University of Michigan, who is an expert in something called group iterative multi-level modeling. And what's special about this type of analysis for imaging data is it lets you better retain individual differences, individual heterogeneity, say in connections is what we were looking at in this study across different nodes of these tripartite network that we've been interested in. It also can incorporate group level information, and our thought was perhaps by doing both, but especially retaining that person's specific information about connections between the brain, we might have more sensitivity to showing how do tripartite network relationships change from before to after CBT compared to that comparator treatment. So similar to the other resting state study, although this one actually was a task-based connectivity study, we looked at those three networks that we cared about with 13 different nodes representing each of the networks and looked at connections between these different nodes or these different regions of interest. And what we were looking for is, are there effects of one treatment versus the other, CBT versus SMT, stress management training over time? Are there effects of age group, and do changes in the brain differ between age groups over time? So just briefly, this is kind of a complicated slide, but here what I'm showing you is what spews out of this GIMI analysis, this type of individual difference analysis, is you're seeing here a 15-year-old girl and a 16-year-old girl, and how different the brain connections are between these different nodes or regions that reflect those three tripartite networks. These differences get retained and pushed into an analysis that allows you to look at all adolescents compared to all adults, both before and after treatment with either, this is CBT, just to confuse you, exposure and response prevention is another way to talk about CBT for OCD. And here what we found is that there was indeed a change that we were unable to detect using the more traditional group averaging analysis. With this new GIMI method, we were able to see that connectivity between frontal parietal network nodes, so that dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the parietal cortex increased, got stronger with treatment specifically in CBT, not SMT. And at the same time, atypical connectivity, that is between this task positive frontal parietal network and that default mode network, which I mentioned they're reciprocal. When the one turns on, the other is supposed to turn off. We saw that with CBT, patients had decreased connections between these two networks that much data would suggest normatively should be less interacting, particularly during a task. So these are connections during the performance of that incentive flanker task. So this is just a summary of what I just said. The CBT specific changes, which were true of adolescents and adults, so across the age groups, were increased connectivity in this cognitive control network, the frontal parietal network, and decreased connectivity of this cognitive control and default mode network from before to after CBT. And again, stable across adolescents and adults. But what we do know, including from this data set, which I didn't show you, is this pattern of increasing cognitive control network, decreasing interactions between the network for cognitive control and default mode function is normative. That tends to occur in healthy development with age, suggesting that these CBT specific shifts in our adolescent and adult patients could reflect CBT working on the brain to sort of induce more mature patterns of connections between these networks. And then this is the very last point I wanted to make. The whole time so far, I've been talking a lot about OCD, and I've been talking about using functional MRI in particular to study changes that happen, or predictors in the brain of a gold standard treatment outcome, that is cognitive behavior therapy, and changes in the brain. But can we use what we have learned about these tripartite networks and or any of the cognitive control functions that they serve, not only being abnormal, but maybe changing with CBT to design a new treatment? And so more specifically, can cognitive control at the level of the brain be trained to reduce anxiety symptoms? So to do this, we set out to look at anxiety at very earliest stages by recruiting clinically anxious preschoolers. So these were 4 to 7-year-old kids. Essentially looking at the notion that, too much fear and too little cognitive control could drive anxiety. And if we could use cognitive training to boost up cognitive control, perhaps boost up that anterior cingulate response to errors. You remember the error-related negativity? It would help drive down anxiety symptoms. And the reason that we went back to EEG as compared to the functional MRI in these young kids is it's just a little bit easier to collect. It's still not easy, but for this, you can be out in a room and you're wearing this funny little cap, like you see this guy. This is actually my son about, many years ago. He's now 23. And that it's just much easier in young kids to do this than to stick them in a scanner, which is this long tube and can be a little scary. And so what we did was, how do we train the brain to boost this error-related negativity, to boost behavioral capacity, so measured behaviorally for cognitive control, and will that drive down anxiety? So we borrowed from colleagues, Jeff Halperin, who had designed a play-based cognitive training study to treat children with ADHD, older kids. And we thought, well, maybe we can adapt this and use this in our anxious preschoolers. And what this cognitive training entails is just groups of clinically anxious preschoolers. So maybe 4 of them, maybe 6, and playing games they know and love. So these are games like Red Light, Green Light, and Simon Says, which, as you might imagine, require a kid to remember the rules, so that's working memory, require a kid to inhibit a response that isn't correct. So for example, you want to get to the finish line real fast, but if the red light's up, you got to stop, otherwise you're out. And then making mistakes. And by practicing games that got progressively harder and harder over the course of 4 separate sessions, we actually have it at 5 now, we thought just maybe we'll be able to drive up both brain and behavioral markers of cognitive control, and that this could help kids feel the fear and do it anyways. So kind of generalize to where they would be experiencing less anxiety. So this is a pilot study, which is I'm sorry, Hans, I didn't put your name on here. I need to do that. But you can see it's pretty small. There were 32 kids that completed. There were 12 who didn't. We used something called the Spence Preschool Anxiety Scale, which was parent report on child anxiety, to measure how anxious the kids were, and this is before treatment, as well as something called the Child Behavior Checklist to measure ADHD symptoms, which, you know, were subclinical as compared to these numbers are just telling you they were clinically anxious, but they didn't have ADHD. And what did we find from before to after this cognitive training camp, which we call Camp Kid Power? We did find, as predicted, that from before to after treatment, that error-related negativity, the cognitive control signal maybe for detecting an error and adjusting your behavior got bigger. The ability to do cognitively challenging tasks that demand cognitive control, or I've used effortful control in this slide, increased on something called the head, toes, knees, and shoulder task, a non-trained behavioral task, and another one called the dinky toys task. So that got better. And here you see that parent-rated anxiety on the Spence Preschool Anxiety Index scale came down. So as predicted, and again, it's just an open label trial, it's a small study, but we were seeing that the cognitive training camp, the Camp Kid Power, performed as we thought it might, that it would drive up brain behavioral markers for cognitive control and down anxiety. So our next steps for this study are, we're currently nearing the end of completing a randomized controlled trial funded by National Institute of Mental Health, comparing that Kid Power, these structured training games that boost cognitive control, versus a playgroup control. So it controls for both of the sets of kids in these camps. You just have to separate from mom and dad, play games with other kids and with camp counselors they've never met before, but only this active condition, the Kid Power cognitive training, has the cognitive training games. And as before, we're collecting that error-related negativity before and after treatment. We're also collecting the behavioral measures of cognitive control, but then we've added this interchannel phase synchrony, which we think is an index of dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is that other network, not so much the salience detection that we think the error-related negativity is getting at, but the other cognitive control network, the frontal-parietal network for adaptive control, testing the degree to which this cognitive control training may help kids increase cognitive control as measured by error signaling, and predicting that that will drive up adaptive control as indexed by this this other marker of the frontal parietal network. We're also assessing fear, kind of testing that idea that it could be an imbalance, too much fear, too little cognitive control. So those results will be coming out probably in the next year or so. So just to kind of wrap up here, what we have been looking at is, does cognitive control, is it even involved in anxiety and or OCD from young ages? We've developed more and more evidence to suggest that yes, it does, both from EEG and fMRI, but that, that there may be some developmental effects. These developmental effects are not universal. So for example, there may be some age-specific involvement of the ERN in expressing anxiety, that developmental shift that I was mentioning, where a big ERN, more anxiety in adults, but at some point downward into development, younger kids may have the reverse. But also that some of these functional relationships may be conserved at different ages. So as you saw with that OCD CBT gimme study I was talking about, where we found before to after treatment, CBT increased network connectivity within a cognitive control network and decreased connectivity of that network with a default mode network. That was true across the adolescents and adults. We interpret it in a developmental context because we know that that's the pattern that normally emerges with healthy maturation, but that changes from pre to post CBT were the same in both age groups. And so, as I mentioned, the strategies that we've been using is targeting these neural networks that we know are involved in cognitive control with a cognitive training strategy. So the play-based Camp Kid Power was the example that I gave you. I just direct your attention down here. We believe we're about to be able to start a study through funding that would test a cognitive training app. So something you can do right on your iPad at home to see if that can kind of prime the brain, boost up that cognitive control network before you even start CBT for OCD in children. Other directions that we think of taking this in the future is, what if you compare some of these more novel strategies, cognitive control training, to what we know is the gold standard, so cognitive behavior therapy, and certainly looking at them in combination, as I already alluded to. Could your brain, before treatment, determine if you're more likely to respond to CBT as usual versus you need something else? And then finally, how does these neural systems for cognitive control interact with other brain systems, such as brain reactivity to fear, such as the reward processing that we looked at a little bit in the work that I presented? And in the long term, will it be possible to use what we know about clinical neuroscience, that is the brain and how it's functioning and potentially functioning atypically in someone who has more anxiety or OCD symptoms? Can we use that to both predict response to treatments, but even more importantly, to develop new ones? And you might even imagine a situation where different combinations of these sort of building blocks, if you will, neural systems for cognitive control, fear, and reward might combine in different ways to drive different expressions of anxiety or even other things such as depression, and might need to be targeted in different ways, including with sensitivity to development. And so with that, I want to thank you very much for your attention. And I've just highlighted some of my collaborators here on this slide. I think most importantly is to thank study families. It's a big deal for little kids and big kids to get into, to deal with an EEG or get into an fMRI scanner. And then thank funders, including the BBRF, which you see here. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you for really such a full presentation. I have to tell you, you answered a number of the questions that came through in the course of your presentation, so I appreciate you doing that. And I really appreciate the work that you've been doing and look forward to hearing the ongoing results as you follow up with Camp Kid Power and some of the other work you're doing. It is, I think, very important work. So thank you for presenting to us and for all that you're doing in this area.
Thank you, Jeff.
I want to, in addition to thanking you, Kate, I want to thank people who joined us today. And I want to share that BBRF has received a $1 million challenge match for 2023 from two very generous family foundations that are passionate about our mission. The goal of the match is to accelerate the momentum in brain research as further breakthroughs are still needed. You can participate in this initiative if you're a new BBRF donor, a past donor who has lapsed but makes a new donation this year, or a current donor who increases your 2023 gift, with your increased amount being the amount that gets matched. I hope you'll consider making a donation to BBRF today. As always, 100% of every dollar donated for research is invested in our research grants. We're able to do this because our operating expenses are covered by separate foundation grants. This means that when you donate $1 for research, that dollar goes directly to the scientists. Please make a gift by visiting our website, bbrfoundation.org, or calling us at 1-800-829-8289. This webinar has been recorded. If you've missed any portion or would like to share it, please visit the events and webinar page on our website. And please join us again next month on July 11th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, when Dr. Sandra Sanchez-Roigi, an associate professor at the Department of Psychiatry at the University of California, San Diego, and also at the in the Department of Medicine, Division of Genetic Medicine at Vanderbilt University Medical Center, will present what genetics is telling us about substance use disorders. Thank you, and remember, together we can dramatically improve the lives of those living with mental illness and enable more people to live full, happy, and productive lives. Thank you.